When my mother-in-law threw that cake at me during my birthday lunch, I knew everything was about to unravel. What would you do if someone revealed your deepest secret in front of everyone you loved? Stick around to hear how one moment changed my marriage, my family, and my life forever. The sunlight filtered through the cream-colored drapes in the dining room, casting a soft, almost poetic glow over the scene. But no amount of sunlight could chase away the tension that clung to the air like an invisible fog. Judith, my mother-in-law, was in her element. Her sharp voice carried from the kitchen as she orchestrated the lunch preparations, her words as biting as the chill that had unexpectedly settled over the otherwise warm spring day. I adjusted my dress in the mirror, pretending I hadn't heard her latest remark about my poor choice of color. It wasn't a good start, but it was expected. Judith had a way of making everything about her, even my birthday. Still, I plastered a polite smile on my face, the kind I'd perfected over the years of being married to Ethan. Ethan, my husband of 5 years, had a complicated relationship with his mother. She adored him, but her love came with conditions. She wanted control, influence, and constant reassurance that no one, not even his wife, would ever take her place. And me? Well, I was the outsider she had reluctantly accepted, but never truly welcomed. I sighed, brushing invisible lint off my dress as I waited in the guest room upstairs. I could already hear the voices of family and friends downstairs, mingling and laughing. Judith's parties were always grand, even for occasions that didn't call for extravagance. But today her efforts felt particularly pointed. The floral centerpieces on the table, the gold-edged china, the expensive champagne chilling in a silver bucket. It was all so unnecessary for a small family lunch. Unnecessary, but not surprising. Ethan poked his head into the room, his sandy blonde hair slightly disheveled. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay? You've been up here for a while." I forced a smile, just needed a moment. He stepped inside, his blue eyes scanning my face with concern. "It's your day. Don't let her ruin it." Ethan knew. He always knew. Though he rarely intervened in Judith's antics, he was aware of how much she grated on me. "I won't," I said, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. He kissed my forehead, a quick, absent-minded gesture before heading back downstairs. As the door clicked shut behind him, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. My stomach churned, not from Judith's remarks or even the pressure of the lunch, but from the weight of my own guilt. Because Judith didn't know everything, but she knew enough. The dining table was a masterpiece of excess. Judith's taste for grandeur was evident in every detail, from the embroidered tablecloth to the crystal glasses that sparkled under the chandelier. She stood at the head of the table, her perfectly coiffed hair and pearl necklace making her look like a picture-perfect matriarch. Her lips curved into a tight smile as she motioned for everyone to take their seats. "Darling," she called to me in her clipped tone, "why don't you sit here, next to Ethan?" Her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and I felt the familiar chill of her disapproval. She was watching me closely today, her gaze sharper than usual. I swallowed hard and sat down, determined not to let her rattle me. Lunch began with polite conversation. Ethan's siblings discussed work and travel plans, while his father cracked jokes that earned obligatory chuckles. I chimed in occasionally, careful to keep my tone neutral. But Judith was unusually quiet, her eyes darting between me and Ethan like she was studying us. I knew something was coming, and then it began. "So," Judith said, her voice carrying over the clinking of silverware, "how are things at work, dear? Still busy?" Her question was innocuous on the surface, but there was an edge to it that made my chest tighten. She knew I had been staying late at the office more often than usual, but she didn't know why. At least, I didn't think she did. "Busy, yes," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Lots of new projects." Judith raised an eyebrow. New projects? How exciting. Ethan, darling, have you seen any of these projects or are they top secret? Ethan chuckled awkwardly. She's always working hard. I don't need to see them to know that. I gave him a grateful smile, but Judith wasn't done. Of course, she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. It's so important to stay committed to one's work. Though I must say, it seems like you've been exceptionally devoted lately. Her words hung in the air like a dagger. I forced myself to take a sip of water, my throat suddenly dry. What are you getting at, Mom? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. Judith waved a hand dismissively. Oh, nothing. Just making an observation. You know me, always paying attention to the little thing. Her gaze locked onto mine, and for a split second I saw something in her eyes. A glimmer of knowledge, a silent accusation. I looked away, my heart pounding. The tension eased slightly as dessert was brought out. The cake was beautiful, an elaborate creation of chocolate and raspberries that Judith claimed she had ordered from the best bakery in town. She cut the first slice and handed it to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Happy birthday, dear, she said, her tone deceptively warm. Thank you, I murmured, taking the plate. For a brief moment, I thought the worst was over. But then, as everyone dug into their cake, Judith spoke again. I have a little surprise for you, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. A special gift, you could say. I froze. Judith loved surprises, but they were rarely pleasant. She stood, holding up her glass for a toast. To my dear daughter-in-law, she began, her tone sickly sweet. May this year bring you clarity, accountability, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the wonderful husband you have. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Judith, Ethan said sharply. What are you doing? Judith ignored him, her eyes fixed on me. It's a shame, really, she said, tilting her head, when people don't realize how lucky they are until it's too late. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say a word, Judith reached for the cake. And then, in one swift motion, she hurled it at me. The room erupted into chaos. I sat there, frozen, as chocolate and raspberries slid down my dress. My ears rang with the sound of gasps and murmurs. Ethan jumped to his feet, shouting, but I barely heard him. Judith's voice cut through the noise. You think I don't know? She hissed, her calm facade finally breaking. I know everything. Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to burst. My secret, the one I thought I had hidden so well, was no longer safe. And in that moment, as the weight of her accusation settled over me, I realized one thing. Judith wasn't bluffing. The room was in utter chaos, voices overlapping in confusion and disbelief. Judith stood at the head of the table, her arms crossed, the satisfaction on her face a stark contrast to the stunned silence that enveloped the rest of us. I could feel the sticky remnants of the cake sliding down my face, a humiliating reminder that this wasn't just an outburst. It was a declaration of war. Ethan's voice rose above the commotion. What the hell is wrong with you, Mom? His face was flushed, his fists clenched at his sides. What kind of stunt is this? Judith didn't even flinch. She looked at Ethan with that calm, condescending expression she reserved for moments when she wanted to assert dominance. I'm doing what any mother would do, Ethan, protecting my son. Protecting me, Ethan scoffed. From what, a cake? From betrayal, Judith said sharply, her gaze snapping back to me. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. The air seemed to drain from the room. Everyone stopped talking, their eyes darting between me and Judith, trying to piece together what was happening. My pulse was racing, my throat dry. I couldn't find the words to defend myself because, deep down, I knew she had something. But what? I pushed back my chair, forcing myself to stand despite my trembling knees. Judith, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This is a family gathering, not a place for your theatrics. If you have something to say, just say it. Her eyes gleamed, as though she'd been waiting for me to give her that opening. Oh, I'll say it, she said, taking a step closer. Ethan, do you know where your wife was last Friday evening? I froze. My mind raced, trying to recall every detail of last Friday. The late meeting, the glass of wine with a colleague. Him. Judith, Ethan said, his voice laced with warning. Whatever you're trying to imply, stop. She ignored him, her eyes never leaving mine. She was out, not at work, not at home, out with someone else. Gasps rippled through the room, and I felt the weight of everyone's gaze settle on me. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and I willed myself not to crumble. You're making assumptions, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. You don't know what you're talking about. Judith smirked, reaching into her purse. Oh, but I do. She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen before holding it up for Ethan to see. Recognize this? Ethan took the phone, his brow furrowing as he stared at the screen. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally to something I couldn't quite read. What is this? He asked, his voice tight. It's a photo, Judith said smugly, taken by a friend of mine who happened to be at the same restaurant. That's your wife, isn't it? And that's not you she's sitting with. The room seemed to tilt as the walls closed in around me. I wanted to deny it, to say the photo was doctored, but I knew it wasn't. The grainy image showed me sitting across from him, leaning in as we spoke. It wasn't intimate, at least not in the way Judith wanted to frame it. But it was enough to plant seeds of doubt. Ethan's jaw tightened as he handed the phone back to her. So what? She had dinner with someone from work. That's not proof of anything. Judith raised an eyebrow. And what about the second photo? My stomach dropped. There was another one? She swiped to the next image and held it up for everyone to see. This one was worse, much worse. It showed him standing too close, his hand brushing mine as we left the restaurant. It wasn't incriminating in a blatant sense, but it was enough to make anyone question the nature of our relationship. Ethan turned to me, his eyes searching mine. What's going on, Anna? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and regret. I hadn't done anything that night, nothing that crossed a line. But the context, the timing, and the way Judith presented it made it impossible to explain. She's been lying to you, Judith said, her voice soft but laced with triumph. I didn't want to believe it, Ethan, but the signs have been there for months. The late nights, the secrecy. Stop, Ethan said, his voice cold. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Is it true? No. The word burst out of me before I could think. Ethan, I swear it's not what it looks like. That man is a colleague. We were discussing a project, that's all. Judith snorted. A project? Over candlelight and wine? Tears pricked at my eyes as I struggled to compose myself. It wasn't romantic. I didn't do anything wrong. Then why didn't you tell him? Judith pressed, her voice growing sharper. If it was so innocent, why the secrecy? I couldn't answer. She had me cornered, and no matter what I said, it wouldn't matter. The doubt was already planted. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Anna, I need to hear the truth. All of it. I looked at him, my heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. There's nothing more to tell. I didn't cheat on you, Ethan, I swear. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. I want to believe you, he said finally, but I can't ignore this. The words hit me like a physical blow. I reached out to him, but he stepped back, his face hardening. I need some time, he said quietly, turning and walking out of the room. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, leaving me standing there in silence. Judith smiled, victorious. Well, she said, picking up her glass of champagne, I think that concludes this little celebration. Happy birthday, Anna." She turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the shattered remnants of my life. I stood frozen in the aftermath, Judith's smug departure still lingering in the air. The room, now suffused with an unbearable awkwardness, began to clear as family members murmured their excuses and shuffled out, unwilling to witness any more of the carnage. I barely registered them leaving, my mind stuck on the. I didn't know how long I stood there before a soft voice broke through my haze. "Are you okay?" It was Ethan's younger sister, Claire. She lingered near the doorway, her gaze a mixture of concern and curiosity. I tried to muster a response, but my voice failed me. Instead, I nodded stiffly, though I was anything but okay. My cheeks burned with humiliation, and my heart pounded as I replayed the scene over and over in my head. The photos, the accusations, Ethan's hurt expression. Claire hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said gently, her voice low as if afraid Judith might hear from the other room. "But you should go after him." Her words jolted me into action. She was right. Ethan needed to hear the truth. From me, not from his manipulative mother. "Thanks," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I grabbed my purse and hurried out the front door, ignoring the judgmental stares of the remaining family members clustered in the foyer. I needed to find Ethan before Judith's poison sunk too deep. The driveway was empty, his car already gone. Panic welled up in my chest as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed his number, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Carson, please," I said, my voice breaking. "Let's talk. Just call me back." I hung up, frustration bubbling to the surface. Where would he go? Home? To a friend's house? I made a split-second decision to drive home, hoping against hope that he'd gone there to cool off. The drive was a blur, my thoughts consumed by everything that had just unfolded. The photos, the accusations, Judith's smug satisfaction as she tore my life apart in front of everyone. When I pulled into the driveway, relief washed over me at the sight of Ethan's car parked outside. I rushed inside, my heart pounding as I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with hurt. "Anna," he said quietly, "just tell me the truth, please." I hesitated, my throat tightening. "I already told you the truth," I said, my voice cracking. "Those photos? They're not what they look like. Yes, I had dinner with him, yes. I didn't tell you, but it wasn't an affair." He shook his head, his frustration evident. "Why didn't you tell me then? Why keep it a secret?" I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Because I was afraid of how it would look," I admitted. I knew Judith would twist it into something it wasn't, and I didn't want to give her more ammunition. But I see now that hiding it only made it worse. Ethan leaned back, his jaw tight. "You've been distant lately," he said. "I've felt it, Anna. It's like you've been pulling away from me. Is this why?" "No," I said quickly. "It's not like that. Yes, I've been distant, but it's not because of him. It's because—" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It's because I've felt so alone, Ethan. You've been so consumed with work, and I didn't know how to tell you." His expression softened slightly, but the pain in his eyes remained. "So what, you turned to someone else instead of coming to me?" "No," I insisted. "It wasn't like that. He was just someone who listened when I needed to vent. I know it was wrong to keep it from you, but it wasn't an affair, I swear." He stared at me for a long moment, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. Finally he spoke. "I want to believe you, Anna. I really do. But right now, I don't know what to think." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I took a step closer to him. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I should have told you everything from the start. I should have trusted you." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need time," he said quietly, "to process this, to figure out what we do next." His words were a dagger to my heart, but I nodded. "Take all the time you need," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just, please don't shut me out." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor. The days that followed were excruciating. Ethan moved through the house like a ghost, barely speaking to me. I tried to give him space, but the silence was unbearable. I started therapy, desperate to understand how I'd let things spiral so far out of control. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Lawson, helped me unpack the feelings of loneliness and inadequacy that had driven me to seek validation outside my marriage. "It's not an excuse," I told her during one session. But I felt so invisible, like I didn't matter. "And now," Dr. Lawson asked gently, "do you still feel invisible?" I thought about it for a moment before shaking my head. "No," I said. "I feel seen, but not in the way I want to be." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Rebuilding trust takes time," she said, "but it starts with accountability. Have you taken responsibility for your part in this?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I've owned up to everything with Ethan. Now I just have to hope he can forgive me." One evening, a week after the disastrous lunch, Ethan came home from work and found me sitting in the living room. He hesitated in the doorway before walking over and sitting down across from me. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice measured, "about us, about what happened." I held my breath, waiting for him to continue. "I'm willing to try," he said finally, "but I need you to be honest with me from now on. No more secrets, no more hiding." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "I promise," I said, "no more secret." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The days following Ethan's decision to try felt fragile, like walking across thin ice. Every interaction between us carried an unspoken tension, a mix of hurt, uncertainty, and tentative hope. We moved cautiously around each other, neither of us wanting to disrupt the fragile truce we'd established. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward something better. Ethan suggested counseling. "If we're going to rebuild this," he said, his voice low and careful, "we need help." I agreed without hesitation, anything to salvage what we had. Our first session with the counselor, Dr. Jensen, was an emotional minefield. We sat in a small, softly lit room, facing each other for what felt like the first time in months. Dr. Jensen, a calm and empathetic man in his 40s, guided the conversation with gentle but probing questions. "I want each of you to describe in your own words what you believe led to this situation," he began. Ethan went first. His voice was steady, but the pain behind his words was unmistakable. "I've always thought we had a strong marriage," he said, "but somewhere along the way we lost each other. I let work take over my life, thinking I was doing it for us, for our future, but in doing that I stopped paying attention to Anna. Hearing his admission was like a knife to my heart. I wanted to interrupt, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but Dr. Jensen held up a hand, signaling me to wait. Ethan continued. "When I saw those photos, it felt like a betrayal. Not just because of what they implied, but because I realized how blind I'd been to what Anna was feeling. I thought we were okay, but clearly we weren't." Dr. Jensen nodded, then turned to me. "Anna, what about you? What do you think contributed to this?" I hesitated, tears welling in my eyes. "I felt invisible," I admitted, my voice trembling. Ethan was always working, always busy. I knew he loved me, but I felt like I was at the bottom of his priorities. I started to resent him for it, but instead of talking to him about it, I turned to someone else. I took a deep breath, the weight of my confession heavy in the air. It wasn't an affair, not physically, but emotionally I crossed a line. I sought comfort and validation from someone who wasn't my husband, and that was wrong. I should have come to Ethan. I should have told him how I was feeling. Ethan's expression softened, but the hurt in his eyes remained. "Why didn't you?" he asked, his voice quiet. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "Because I was afraid you wouldn't understand, or worse, that you wouldn't care." Dr. Jensen leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "It's clear that both of you have been carrying unspoken pain. The good news is you're both here, willing to work through it. That's the first step toward healing." Over the next few weeks, our sessions with Dr. Jensen became a lifeline. We learned to communicate in ways we hadn't before, to express our needs and fears without judgment or defensiveness. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the conversations became heated, when old wounds were reopened. But each time we pushed through, determined to rebuild what we had lost. Outside of counseling, Ethan and I made an effort to reconnect. We started having dinner together every night, no phones or distractions allowed. We went for walks, talked about our days, and rediscovered the little things we loved about each other. It felt awkward at first, like trying to rebuild muscle memory after an injury, but slowly, it began to feel natural again. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Ethan reached for my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were a team again. But not everything was resolved. Judith remained a looming presence, her interference a constant reminder of the damage she had caused. Ethan had confronted her shortly after our disastrous lunch, demanding an explanation for her actions. "She's lying to you," Judith had insisted, her tone cold and unyielding. "I was protecting you, Ethan. You deserve better." Ethan had shut her down, telling her in no uncertain terms that her behavior was unacceptable. But I knew Judith wouldn't back down so easily. She thrived on control, and my presence in Ethan's life threatened that. I doubted she would ever truly accept me. Still, for the sake of peace, I decided to confront her myself. A week after Ethan's conversation with her, I invited Judith to meet me for coffee. She arrived at the cafe looking as composed as ever, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "Well," she said, sliding into the seat across from me, "this is unexpected." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I think we need to talk." Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "About what? Your lies? Your little work dinners?" I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. "I made mistakes," I admitted. "I should have been honest with Ethan from the start. But what you did, humiliating me in front of the entire family, that was cruel." Judith raised an eyebrow, her expression unrepentant. "I did what I thought was necessary." "Necessary?" I echoed, my voice rising slightly. "Destroying your son's trust in me, in our marriage? How was that necessary?" Her eyes narrowed. "Ethan deserves better." "Better than what?" I shot back. "Someone who loves him? Someone who's willing to fight for our marriage? Because that's what I'm doing, Judith. I'm fighting. And I won't let you come between us." She leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead she simply said, "We'll see." It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was enough, for now. As weeks turned into months, Ethan and I continued to work on our marriage. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of doubt and insecurity, but we were making progress. Slowly but surely we were finding our way back to each other. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan reached for my hand. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice soft. I nodded, squeezing his hand. "We still have a long way to go." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, but I think we'll get there." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed him. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that allowed you to hear your own thoughts far too clearly. Ethan had gone to bed early, exhaustion from another long day pulling him under, while I stayed behind in the living room, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The weight of everything still sat heavy on my chest, but it was no longer the suffocating kind of weight it had been a few weeks ago. Instead, it was a quieter ache, a reminder of what had been broken and what we were trying to rebuild. The therapy sessions had helped, but they had also forced me to confront parts of myself I had been avoiding for years. For the first time, I was peeling back the layers of my own choices, examining the cracks in my marriage and my role in creating them. Why had I let it get so far? Why had I sought validation from someone who wasn't my husband instead of simply reaching for Ethan, the man I vowed to stand by? The answers were messy, tangled up in years of unspoken resentment, loneliness, and fear. But they were also freeing, because acknowledging my faults meant I could finally begin to change. I thought back to the first time I met Ethan. It was at a mutual friend's wedding. He had been standing by the bar, a drink in hand, laughing at some joke I hadn't heard. There was something about him, his easy confidence, the way his smile lit up the room, that drew me in immediately. When he caught me staring, I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. But instead of looking away, he walked right over and introduced himself. That night, we talked for hours, and by the end of it, I knew he was someone I wanted in my life. He made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had, like I mattered, like I was enough. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. Or maybe we both did. Judith had been a constant presence in our relationship from the beginning. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was normal for a mother to be protective of her son. But Judith wasn't just protective, she was possessive. Her influence over Ethan a force I could never fully escape. I thought I could handle it, that my love for Ethan would be enough to drown out her disapproval. But over the years, her relentless criticism began to wear on me. She questioned my every decision, found fault in every move I made, and Ethan, caught in the middle, rarely intervened. At first, I tried to fight back, standing my ground against her subtle digs and overt meddling. But eventually, I grew tired. It was easier to stay quiet, to let her win, than to keep fighting a battle I knew I couldn't win. And then there was Ethan. He was a good man, a kind man, but he wasn't perfect. His work consumed him, especially in recent years, and the time we once spent together was replaced with late nights and long silences. I told myself it wasn't his fault, that he was doing it for us, but the loneliness grew until it became unbearable. That's when he came into the picture. It started innocently enough. A late-night brainstorming session at work turned into casual drinks. Drinks turned into long conversations. He listened to me, really listened, in a way I hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't love, not even close, but it filled a void I hadn't realized was there. I told myself it was harmless, that I wasn't doing anything wrong, but deep down I knew it wasn't true. Every time I avoided telling Ethan where I was or who I was with, every time I let a text linger on my phone without deleting it, I felt the weight of my choices. Judith's intervention, as cruel and humiliating as it was, had been a wake-up call. She had forced me to confront the reality of my actions in a way I could no longer ignore. I hated her for it, but I couldn't deny that it had been a turning point. Dr. Jensen's words echoed in my mind. Accountability isn't just admitting what you've done. It's understanding why you did it and making the choice to do better. That was what I was trying to do now, to be better for Ethan, for myself. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair messy from sleep, a frown creasing his face. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. I shook my head, just thinking. He walked over and sat beside me on the couch, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything unspoken filling the space between us. "I've been thinking, too," he said finally, his voice low, "about us." I turned to him, my heart racing. "And?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've realized I wasn't there for you the way I should have been. I thought providing for us was enough, but I see now that it wasn't. You needed more, and I didn't give it to you." Tears filled my eyes as I reached for his hand. "Ethan, it wasn't just you. I should have talked to you instead of shutting you out. I should have fought for us instead of looking for answers somewhere else." He squeezed my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We both made mistakes," he said. "But I don't want to lose you, Anna. I want to fight for us. I just need to know that you do too." "I do," I said, my voice breaking. "I love you, Ethan. I never stop." He pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe that we could make it. That love, though bruised and battered, was still there, waiting to be rebuilt. That night, as we lay in bed, Ethan's arm wrapped around me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. It wasn't the peace of resolution. It was the peace of possibility. The understanding that while our journey was far from over, we were both willing to take the steps necessary to heal. As I drifted off to sleep, I whispered a silent promise to myself. I would never take this man, this love, for granted again. The weeks following my confrontation with Judith were like walking through a dense fog, but for the first time, there was light ahead. Ethan and I were slowly rebuilding the foundation of our relationship, brick by painstaking brick. Yet even as we worked to move forward, I couldn't shake the weight of the past, the choices I had made, the mistakes that had brought us to the edge. The quiet moments were the hardest. When Ethan left for work in the morning and I sat alone in the house, my mind would wander back to everything that had happened. I replayed Judith's accusations, the way she had thrown the cake at me with such righteous fury, and the cold look in Ethan's eyes when he asked me if it was true. Those memories were seared into me, reminders of how easily things could unravel. I threw myself into therapy, determined to understand the why behind my actions. Dr. Lawson encouraged me to dig deeper, to explore the feelings I had buried for years. "It's not just about the affair or the near affair," she said during one session. "It's about what led you there. What were you searching for?" The answer didn't come easily. It took weeks of peeling back layers of denial and guilt before I could admit the truth to myself. I had been searching for validation, for attention, for something, anything, that made me feel like I was still seen, still wanted. "I think I was angry," I confessed to Dr. Lawson one afternoon. At Ethan, at myself, I felt invisible, and instead of talking to him about it, I looked for validation somewhere else. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's a common reaction, but the important question is, what have you learned from this?" I took a deep breath, considering her words, that running away from problems doesn't solve them, that I need to communicate even when it's uncomfortable, and that I need to forgive myself. Forgiving myself was the hardest part. I had spent so much time punishing myself for my mistakes, holding on to the guilt like a lifeline. But slowly, with Dr. Lawson's help, I began to let it go. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn from it. I could do better. Ethan and I began to share more of ourselves with each other. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, of lingering doubt, but we were trying. One evening, as we sat on the couch with a bottle of wine, Ethan turned to me, his expression serious. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "All of it?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. "I regret hurting you," I said finally. "I regret not being honest with you, not trusting you to understand. But I don't regret what I've learned from it. It's made me see things more clearly. About myself, about us. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. Do you think we can get back to where we were? I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I don't think we can go back, I admitted. But maybe we can build something new, something stronger. He didn't respond right away, but the way he held my hand told me he was willing to try. Despite our progress, Judith remained a shadow over our lives. She wasn't as overtly antagonistic as before, perhaps because Ethan had finally drawn a line, but her disapproval was always palpable. Family gatherings were tense, her sharp comments carefully veiled but still cutting. At first, I avoided her as much as possible, unwilling to give her another opportunity to humiliate me. But over time, I realized that avoiding her wasn't the answer. If I wanted to truly move forward, I needed to face her head on. At the next family dinner, I made a point to sit across from her. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing as I smiled and made polite conversation with the rest of the table. It wasn't about winning her approval, I knew I would never have that, but about reclaiming my place in the family. I wouldn't let her drive a wedge between Ethan and me any longer. By the end of the evening, Judith's icy demeanor had thawed, if only slightly. She didn't apologize, but she also didn't make any biting remarks. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As the months passed, Ethan and I found a new rhythm. We weren't the same couple we had been before, but in some ways we were better, stronger. We had learned to communicate, to be honest with each other even when it was hard, and most importantly, we had learned to forgive. Not just each other, but ourselves. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan turned to me with a faint smile. "We've been through hell," he said, "but I think we're finally coming out on the other side." I smiled back, my heart swelling with gratitude. "I think so too." It wasn't a perfect ending, life rarely is, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Hopeful for the future, for our marriage, for the people we were becoming. Finale 141. Several months later, Ethan and I hosted a small gathering at our house, a quiet, intimate celebration to mark our anniversary. It felt symbolic, a testament to how far we had come. The air was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the warm glow of candlelight. As I moved through the room, greeting guests and refilling drinks, I caught Ethan's eye from across the room. He smiled at me, a real, genuine smile, and my heart fluttered. That smile, so full of warmth and love, reminded me of why I had fought so hard to save our marriage. Judith was there, of course. She sat in the corner, sipping her wine and observing everything with her usual air of quiet judgment. But for once, her presence didn't bother me. I had made peace with the fact that she would never fully accept me, and that was okay. What mattered was that Ethan and I had found our way back to each other. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests trickled out, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the warm glow of the candles casting soft shadows on the walls. Ethan pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "I'm proud of us," he said softly. "We've come so far." I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "We have," I agreed, "and I'm so grateful." We stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's embrace. In that quiet, intimate moment, I knew we were going to be okay. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, life never is, but we would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The end.